I saw a ceremony of the Dalai Lama. It was with
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I'm not really
I
But Joseph Kelly
Joseph, Joseph has spent a lot of time in Nepal, and I've been in Nepal, and I was able to go to several Tibetan monasteries in Nepal, and it's a radically different experience from what we do. First of all, when you go there, nobody's sitting. There's a lot of chanting and a lot of commotion, so I don't know how anybody could sit in that environment. And if you look around the walls here, everything is very, monochromatic and very austere and very plain. If you're in a Tibetan monastery, the walls are completely covered with brightly colored murals, and it's like super distracting. It looks like an electronic clown threw up on the walls. And there's just constant commotion. So it's almost as polar opposite of what we do here as you could get and still call it Buddhism. So I thought they would make a good topic talking about the history and the ancestors. So I titled this talk Tibet WTF. Buddhism got its start in Tibet in the 7th century. The king Songstam Gampo asked teachers to come from India to Tibet. So this is happening at roughly the same time. 7th century, Bodhidharma had been in China 200 years previous. Hui Ning had already taught. So Buddhism was really established in China at this time. And it's interesting that the Tibetan teachers, the people that first taught in Tibet, came from India, came directly from India, not from China. And in Tibet, there was already a previously existing religion called Bon. And Bon was very heavy on shamanistic traditions, animistic traditions, a lot of gods and goddesses and demons and crazy-looking characters, and a whole set of rituals and traditions, kind of all its own. So this was the environment that Buddhism was going to enter into in the 7th and 8th century. And in the 8th century, the guy who's kind of considered the father of all this was Padmasambhava. And he established a monastery, a large monastery, and established what later became known as the Ingyam school. And he's revered in Tibet as the second Buddha. And he traveled all over Tibet with female consorts, and he made peace with local Bon priests, and it also made peace with all of the local Bon deities. And apparently has hidden secret teachings all over Tibet that we're still apparently waiting to find now. So that's kind of the establishment. 100 years after that, another king, King Lang Dharma, decides that Tibet needed to return to Bon, and he outlaws Buddhism, and tries to bring back the previous shamanistic practices to the country. Problem was, Buddhism was already fairly established, and we're talking about some very, very remote places. And after his death, the country was very destabilized and went into civil war. And when the country restabilized in the 10th century, a new wave of Indian teachers were brought to Tibet. And they were of what are now called the Tantric schools. And these included Tantric traditions. And it's interesting because here in the West you hear the word Tantra and everybody automatically assumes you're talking about Tantric sex practices, where it takes 6 or 7 hours or something like that. Well, shoot, I can do that, but it includes dinner and a movie. But Tantra, there's a lot more to Tantra than just that. The word Tantra means a loom or a warp. So this is going to be, if you look at the sutras almost like pieces of cloth, this is going to be the practices that sew all of them together. So the idea was that the Tantra was a method for seeing the nature of the mind, or seeing through the nature of the mind into reality. So it included a lot of practices. It included mantras or sounds. It included mudras or gestures. And it included what are called mandalas, which are pictures of the universe. And it also included physical work, such as yoga and sitting. So, and these are a lot of the same things we do here. We chant, and everybody's familiar with this mudra. We use it all the time. We also use this one. Also use this one. So this is woven into our practices as well. We don't really use mandalas, but we do have a tradition of art and its use in Zen, especially Hojo's art and his depiction of Buddhist ideas through his abstract paintings. And of course we do the physical work of sitting. So Tantra is not as weird as we've originally been led to believe. So a perfect example of a tantric practice that I thought was pretty interesting was to visualize Avalokiteshvara above your head until you visualize yourself turning into Avalokiteshvara, or Chin Rizig as she's known in Tibetan. So that's kind of it's kind of a meditative prop almost. So we go to the 13th century, and here's where things start to get really interesting. Tibet was annexed into the Mongol Empire. And as everybody knows, the Mongol Empire later became China's Yuan dynasty. It was founded by Kublai Khan. Buddhism flourished under Mongol rule. And the Mongolians were very, very tolerant of religions. They themselves, their natural or native religion, they worshipped a sky god named Tinri. But as they came in contact with more and more different cultures, as they marched all the way into Europe, they incorporated a lot of other religious ideas. And Genghis Khan himself was absolutely fascinated with theology and religion. And what a lot of people don't know is that he actually died a Christian. He was baptized just because he thought it was interesting. So they were very, very tolerant of Buddhism in the neighboring countries. To the point where the Emperor Mongke, after the Mongol Empire had divided up into three separate factions, he declared Buddhism the state religion, and he favored Tibetan practices for himself and for his court. In the 14th centuries, the western factions of the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, adopted Islam, leaving only the eastern faction of the former empire as Buddhist. And in the somewhere between 1569 and 1578, we have the beginning of the lineage, which is known as the Dalai Lama, which is kind of what everybody sees as the face of Tibetan Buddhism. And this is a reincarnated personage through time, and every generation or a few generations has its Dalai Lama. We're on Dalai Lama number 14. But where this tradition originally comes from is really interesting. A monk in the 1570s declared, his name was Sonam Gyatso, and he declared that he was the reincarnation of Drogon Chogyal Phaga, who was the monk who had originally converted Kublai Khan. And he then said that the current king, Alta Khan, was the reincarnation of Kublai Khan. And when this occurred, Alta Khan basically said, you are now the regent of Tibet. You will be the political and religious leader, and who is picked as your successor will then become the religious and political leader, and you will have the protection of the Mongol army. So that's where the whole concept of Dalai Lama originally comes from. It was a political appointment, and a political appointment by the Mongol Empire in return for military protection. So that's not at all what we typically think of when we think of the Dalai Lama. And this union or in league with the Mongols may be what has caused Tibet so much consternation with the Chinese. In the 17th century, the Dalai Lama at the time was declared regent of Tibet by the Mongol clans and allowed to operate as an independent state. So no longer a vassal state, an actual independent state, and they were an independent state for almost 400 years, but still backed by Mongol military power. In 1950, Tibet was annexed by China, which set into motion the events that most of us are familiar with. And the 1959, the Dalai Lama himself leaves Tibet for India and begins what's known as the Tibetan diaspora. And there's large, as Adam just mentioned, there's large Tibetan populations in India. There's Tibetan populations here in the U.S. We have a Tibetan school right here in Atlanta. So that's kind of what catches us up to the middle age, or the modern age. No, I don't think any discussion of Tibetan Buddhism would be complete without their great saint, discussing their great saint Milarepa. Very interesting guy, and we'll see some common themes in his story. 10th century, he was a merchant's son. The father died when he was very young, leaving the family in hard times. The family was shunned by relatives and by townspeople, and the mother got obsessed with this idea of revenge, which her son Milarepa took up as well. And one of the taunts that the family heard was, if you are many, make war, but if you are few, make magic. Well, that turned out to bite them very, very badly, because she then sent Milarepa to study black magic with several shamans. Milarepa returns from his training, and he wipes out the entire town by using enormous scorpions to catch and kill people. And then he unleashes a hailstorm which destroys the entire year's crops. So Milarepa got his revenge for his shunned family. Problem is, after this, he went into this very, very deep state of regret and remorse for what he had done. And he then went to study with a Buddhist teacher named Marpa in order to gain some kind of redemption. And Marpa's training methods, by modern standards, if you read the story, were absolutely brutal. And what he had Milarepa doing was building watchtowers only to tear them down, just to teach him about impermanence. Apparently would beat and starve Milarepa on a regular basis, and then finally put him in a small stone building for 4 years, and he was allowed to eat nothing but nettles. And so it was 4 years of sitting. So we see some trends. I mean, in some ways this sounds like Bodhidharma's story of going into retreat and sitting for 9 years. In some ways it sounds almost like Dogen's story of being a merchant's son that gets orphaned at a young age. So I mean, there's a lot of tropes in this story. And eventually Milarepa achieves enlightenment and begins to teach, and he's revered to this day throughout the Himalayas as a great Buddhist saint. So I think some of the importance of this, you know, notwithstanding how Tibetan Buddhism wound up being the face of mainstream Buddhism, but a couple of things we have to look at. That Buddhism, they brought Indian teachers to from the 10th to the 14th century to establish Buddhism in Tibet. By the 14th century, Buddhism had died out in India. It really no longer existed. So in some ways we can look at Tibetan Buddhism as kind of the repository for the original teachings from India, which is I think a very interesting idea. Another thing that happened was these teachers that came to Tibet brought a lot of sutras with them, a lot of documents, and they started translating them from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And that's interesting because that's a much easier transition from a linguistic point of view from going to Sanskrit to Chinese. So we've got a lot of documents that otherwise may have been lost, both in India and in China. So that gives us something to really consider. And there's a lot of theological differences. Tibetan Buddhism places a great amount of emphasis on reincarnation, not rebirth, actual reincarnation. They've got a concept of a tulku, which is a person that's a reincarnated version of another person. So that you've got these lineages that are based on reincarnation, not student or teacher to student transmission, but actual reincarnation. It's supposed to be this person has come back to be reincarnated, be born again, and live among us again. I don't know how tough it is to get declared a tulku. Apparently the actor Steven Seagal is one, so that could lend some questioning to how much credence this whole idea has got. But, who are we to say? So that kind of brings us up to modern times, and we know that the practice of Tibetan Buddhism is very different from what we do, but there are some similar themes and a lot of similar ideas. And I think this idea that Tibetan Buddhism, as is practiced now, could be actually closer to the original Buddhism that was taught and practiced in India, I think could be really interesting, because we know, as we've talked about the Chinese lineage of Chan Buddhism, that there was a lot of influence from Taoism and possibly a significant amount of influence from Greek Stoicism in Bactria. And, we're tracing this back through the Lankavatara Sutra, which is not a sutra that's got a lot of adherents in Tibetan Buddhism. So what I'd like to do now is kind of open the floor first to anybody that's here with us that actually has some experience with studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism, and see what they could tell us. And, as far as answering questions about Tibetan Buddhism, since you've listened to me for the last half hour, you now know everything I know. So I don't know how much help I'm really going to be. But I did think this was an interesting subject. So who here with us has, I think Joseph and Lindy are two that have actually had experience with Tibetan Buddhism. So what can you tell us? Yeah, you get the mic so they can hear you on.
That's not on the spot at all. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for that history, some of which I wasn't entirely familiar with. I remember hearing the stories of Milarepa, and I was a Shambhala person, so Shambhala is the lineage that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche brought from Tibet to the United States, so it's very much the U.S. version of Tibetan Buddhism. And you're right, that the difference in terms of the busy walls, the colors, which I at moments miss, sitting in rows, you're behind somebody, so you're seeing their movement and what they tied in their hair that day, and so I just appreciate observing the differences, and I'm not sure what else to add. Yeah, it was all I knew. It was, when I first endeavored to do this
Oh yeah. So for practical purposes, I'll just say I have time to now, so I'll pass it. I went to. I'm sure I'm going to say this wrong, but I've been to the Drepung Losling. I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation. Yeah. Oh, sure. So I went there, I believe 4 or 5 times, and yes, and I mean it has the most ornate hand-carved altar you've ever seen, and it's quite different. The teacher there did a really good, guided meditation. I mean, it's talking. it's him talking through most of the what you experience there, and I'd say, they have a really good approach to loving kindness meditation, and I really, respect that. It's certainly different from Zen. I mean, but I have a lot of respect for them out of how they approach loving kindness alone. But it was a pretty superficial experience compared to y'all, I'm sure. I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, so I originally took my vows in Thailand with the Theravada tradition, which is kind of the almost antithesis of Tibetan practice, in that they keep it really simple. There's no tantra, though the temple is kind of ornate in a different way. But then I moved to Nepal in 1996, and my goal was to study Tibetan medicine, and through kind of a series of events, I got hired by the United Nations to interview traditional Tibetan doctors in the Himalayas. So I did that for about 6 months, all through the Himalayas, and they obviously were, you call it Tibetan Buddhism, but even in India, in like Ladakh, it's just Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism, really. It was very similar. And I did take my vows in it, but I never had a practice. I was really like a B- Buddhist. But I was working with these traditional Tibetan doctors who have very serious practices. But the interesting thing about Tibetan Buddhism is when you are a serious practitioner, you have like a kind of more worldly or service-oriented aspect to it, whether it's astrology or medicine or art or something. So when you do these retreats, which are really common, is 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, you also are instructed in one of these arts, that both so you can make a living and so you can serve other people. And I had some fantastic experiences. We did a lot of pujas and a lot of empowerments and things like that in caves. I think I was at Martha's Cave at one point, though. It's so long ago, I get them mixed up. And then I had a tea company where we took their formulas, we turned them into herbal teas and sold them through Whole Foods, which was a whole other story. And so I was never really a serious practitioner. And then when I got back to the States, I came back in 1999, I thought I should really sit down and practice now that I have time. And to be perfectly frank, I found like the practices made me more neurotic than I already am. Because it is kind of like it's like Catholicism on steroids and acid. And I just really, I kept going back to the Theravada practice because it was so simple in a lot of ways and straightforward. And then I found Zen, and I liked the logical aspect too, and the sutras and koan study. And then my experiences have been in Boulder, where a lot of Trungpa's former students are, and they don't, I'm not trying to cast shade, but they don't have the greatest reputation, and there's been enormous like scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. I think from like a larger view, Tantra promises enlightenment in this very body, in this very lifetime. Very quick and incisive and powerful. It's a very attractive offer, but then a lot of things can go wrong too. And you can justify a lot of things as Tantra. This is Tantra, And then in the U.S., Tantra's got mixed up with all sorts of things that have nothing to do with Tantra. So I've had a very mixed experience with it. I have to say for the Tibetans, it's unified their culture and held them together in the diaspora. When the Chinese invaded, they burned all the sutras and executed monks. It was really a Holocaust. It wasn't just an invasion. They really tried to eradicate the culture, including Tibetan Buddhism. So it really has held them together. And my Tibetan friends, even the ones who are intellectuals and don't really believe the religious aspects, it's an integral part of their life too. So I think it really depends whether you're talking about Americans practicing Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetans practicing Tibetan Buddhism. It's almost like, are you a Native American practicing a Native American practice, or are you a Anglo practicing a Native American? Not that it's not going to work for you per se, but it's a completely different
Yeah.
phenomenon.
I came across some quotes by the Dalai Lama where he said, if you're not Tibetan, you really shouldn't bother with Tibetan Buddhism. It's not, that's not the point of it.
Well, he did say that age of conversion is over, so if you,
He did say the age of conversion is over. So if you have a practice that kind of works for you,
Yeah.
the psychic, dissonance of trying to learn another language and another style of dress and all that stuff might not be worth it.
I first encountered Zen Buddhism in '96 in Japan, and then I came back here. All this was on tour, and then came into contact with Tibetan Buddhism when we moved. My wife and I moved over to Drew Valley, where it's the neighborhood adjacent to Drayton Russell. Where they were starting to build that. There was a church there, and they renovated the building and made it what you see today. And became quite involved with them, helping out with their AV, kind of like I did here. And went to India when they had the inaugural, or the dedication of the the largest Tibetan. It's not school, it's Drayton, but it's their prayer hall. Seats like 5,000 people, and that's the largest building at the time outside of India. And was getting very involved with it and enjoyed it, but like everyone else has said, it seemed very much, in the way I look at it, there's a lot of distractions with all the stuff, all the accoutrement, all the. I was very much, I like the stripped down monochromatic of Zen and the simplicity of just sitting doing your thing. The guided meditation kind of is a distraction to me. But Geshe-la over there said one time that, it seems like the monochromatic, the black and white version of Zen is because Japan was already endowed with a lot of colors, a lot of seasons. Tibet is basically
It's gray.
snow.
It's gray and white.
So
Yeah, that's it.
They have to, want the colors and all of these
Yeah.
things because it's the exact opposite of what Japan and China have. You don't have really the seasons.
Yeah.
Because it's either very dry or snow.
Right.
So that's kind of, that helped me a lot with figuring out why things are the way things are.
Right.
And plus, whenever you go into a monastery at 7 years old, you gotta have rules. You gotta have a lot of rules.
Yeah.
When I went to India the first time, or to the Tibetan camp, it seemed very much like a college town without the alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Their alcohol is sugar. Drinking sodas like nobody's business all day long. And diabetes is a problem. And when you drink butter tea at low altitude, you don't burn it off like you do at high altitude. So there's a lot of things that didn't change when they came down out of the Himalayas and went to lower India. But what you were saying about the corruption and stuff like that, we had the same thing too. A lot of it seems like Americans can very much allow people to lead them in the wrong path. As long as you're charismatic, sure, I'll follow you. And without doing their own research, without thinking about, thinking what you say.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say, there is a lot of, from what I've read about Tibetan Buddhism around the country, is some people just put on robes and say they've been anointed or whatever, and then people follow them, and then those people are condemned and start all the corruption. It's not
Sure.
all that.
Guru worship.
Yeah, exactly. That's all it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah, I think one thing we have to kind of keep in mind about Tibet and Nepal and the highlands and the Himalayas is that life up there is very hard. I mean, just physically arduous. Just staying fed and moving from one place to another is very, very difficult. And I think as Westerners, that's like alludes to what Joseph was saying. That difficulty of life has got to factor in to their worldview and their theology. And you take that difficulty away, here we are 600-700 feet above sea level, and we're all well fed, and we've got, plenty to do. I mean, you get up there, it's not like that, But one of the monasteries I did go to is one of the well-known monasteries, and it's the place where they have a Yeti's hand and a Yeti's scalp. And so I went there to see the Yeti head, and I find the head priest, they found him for me, he could barely speak English, and I said, I'm here to see the Yeti scalp and the Yeti head. And he goes, yeah, okay. And he points to this green box, it's got a lock on it, he goes, what's in there? And I was like, okay. He goes, I don't have a key. And he said, the only guy that's got a key is like 3 villages from here. And he may be here Wednesday, I don't know. So, I didn't get to see the Yeti hand, but I went to another monastery and I heard all this chanting. All this chanting's going on. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I'm going to stick my head in and look at this. Because I think I've been here for about 10 years when this happened. So I was an initiate. I mean, I was a disciple at this point. And I stick my head in this room where there's all this chanting going on, and it's all teenage boys. And they're all wearing robes, shaved heads. The chanting's going on, but about 4 of these guys have got one kid up on a desk turned upside down, and they're like pounding on him and all like just cracking up laughing. And I'm like, so that's how this is done, I guess. Yeah, I just think it's such a different way of life that it's like really tough to tweeze the way of life out from the theological practice.
Oh, I got it.
Yeah.
And so we're sitting there, I'm about 50 feet from His Holiness. He's giving a, talk, and there's thousands of people over here, right, in the building, in this new building. And first, front row, 2 young monks right there. Middle of, we're sitting there listening, This guy stands up, beats the shit out of that guy next to him, and runs out, and His Holiness looks up there and goes, and right back into what he was saying. I mean, it's just kind of like you're dealing with kids. You're dealing with, elementary all the way to college, and
Right.
Yeah, so I was in India, actually 3 years ago, and at the end of the year, during the cooler part of the year, the Dalai Lama comes to Bodh Gaya, and I happened to be there when he was there, and so he has this ceremony called Kala Chakra. And so it's right. This is the northeast part of India, very close to Nepal, but there's a large diaspora there, so he comes and does a ceremony, and of course, a lot of people congregate there. But speaking of the Tantra stuff, he did this ceremony. Of course, it's on this huge field. And, I had to have an AM radio to have it interpreted in my ears, so it was kind of like a lapse. But even then, from what I understood, these deities exist in the body, like Manjushri's in the throat, and when he would repeat this mantra, this sound, to awaken the deity in the throat, or in the, as you mentioned, Avalokiteshvara above the head, much like the chakras in the body, but it's very, very Hindu in its, you can't separate those, and the animistic kind of stuff as well. But it was interesting that it was like I said, having this really crappy AM radio in my ear, and there being a 20-second lapse in the interpreting, and of course translating something from Tibetan to English, the funny things that he would say would be lost, like in the translation, and everyone, the Tibetans they got like prime seating in front of him, and so kind of foreigners are sitting on the side. I would be like laughing, that's funny, everyone's laughing, but I don't get what was funny. It's lost in translation, but you go with it. But yeah, I also saw a lot of the young monks too, and I think for them it's just a thing to do. Like I don't think it's like some, like we those of us that come here, particularly in a predominantly Judeo-Christian environment, we came here of our own volition. But for them, you could tell that it was just like, that's just what you do.
You're first born.
Yeah, you go into.
The first male goes to, if they're lucky enough to go.
Yeah.
That's what you
Yeah.
It's
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating. But the temples are beautiful, though. The monasteries.
Yeah, they really
are
are.
beautiful.
Yeah, they're incredible.
I never saw anyone meditating or anything.
No, neither
It's
did
lots
I,
of,
yeah.
Lots of chanting, lots of chanting.
Yeah.
That just remind me, when I lived in Kathmandu on Friday nights, this is in the 90s before the internet, we used to go to the Tibetan district, and we'd go to see these pirated movies from Hong Kong, Kung Fu. We took in a Tibetan refugee, a 17-year-old named Tenzin, who came over the border, so him and I would take a little tuk-tuk. We'd go to, it was like a back door and a back door, and it was just a big room. There'd be like 50 of these teenage monks there, And you'd have this Hong Kong movie that obviously someone with a camcorder in a movie theater in Hong Kong had like recorded people walking in front of them and then moving and stuff. And then, and they were always like the most crude, like humor and like violence and like butt jokes and fart jokes. And, but they would be in Chinese, and then a lot of them could speak Chinese. And so then they would all laugh, and then there'd be a translation in English, and then I would laugh. So you'd hear all these like teenage kids just laughing, and then like it was such a weird thing. And,
Yeah.
and then I'd be like, oh, and they'd all look back at me.
Well, yeah. Well,
The translation's not good.
I know.
but
Or if it was about like chicken feet or something, I'd be like, I think it's funny. Like,
But if I think about my absolute best night in Kathmandu, I was sitting in this place and I heard all of this racket coming out of this window, and then these kids start dancing in the alley, and the Nepalese guy we were with, he goes, "Oh yeah, that's a bar. They have bands playing there." And then my friend Art goes, "Was that a record?" And I said, "Nobody makes records that sound like that." And so we went in this place, and the place was called the Buddha Bar, and all around the room they had these alternating murals of the Buddha and Che Guevara, and they had a band. There was 3 teenage Nepalese girls, the worst equipment you've ever heard in your life, and they were doing Ramones covers, and all these teenagers were just bouncing up and down in place, and I was like, I'm just going to move here. This is awesome. But just, this approximation, it's in a way like we're approximating their culture. They're approximating ours. So it's kind of like what this going back and forth of these weird approximations.
I think what people get wrong about the Tibetans is they are very, very, very tough. And as a people, physically, psychologically, and they're a mercantile people. They were in the middle of the Silk Road. And so they can negotiate you down to your last penny. And so, like you said, like the Dalai Lama is a real deal. But I had a friend of mine explain it to me one time. He's like, they need such a strong religion because you're out on this, you're at 15,000 foot on this plateau, and you come across another person. There's nothing to prevent you from like murdering them and taking everything they have, and no one ever knowing about it. So there's an element of you got this like very vital people. They're kind of isolated, but like they were connected to like you mentioned, Greece, to India, to Persia. And they're very kind of clever. They had a 12th century medical symposium, and they invited a Persian, a Greek, an Ayurvedic doctor from India, and a Chinese doctor. And then they had pretty wives for all of them, and they all stayed and married Tibetan. But the reason they did it was to get all their information. you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see a lot of Westerners going there thinking they're like these airy-fairy people, and they're not. They're very, very pragmatic. And then just one other note about, Tibetan medicine is very, very effective. I met people constantly in Mensikong, the Tibetan Medical and Astrological Institute, who've gotten basically death sentences from Western doctors for Parkinson's, cancer. And they were alive and well like 5-10 years later because they weren't just taking Tibetan medicine, but they had a spiritual practice, or they were serious about it, they changed their diet and all those things.
So the medicine was more than physical.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You can't just take it. And then
Yeah, it's not just, not just blood test, it's the whole thing. It's like traditional medicine.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and just one more kind of funny story. We took these Tibetan medicines and turned them into herbal teas you sold through Whole Foods, and it was a totally different mind view. So, like in Tibetan medicine, they have what they call hidden fever. So if you get a fever or a cold and you take ibuprofen or aspirin, then you repress it, and then it gets deep into your system. At some point, it's going to come out, basically. So the cold formula would make it come out, and then you clear it and get better, hopefully. But we get all these angry emails, like, my wife drank your cold tea, and her cold got much worse. She could barely get out of bed. We'd be like, oh, that's very, very good. She's clearing all these hidden fevers, and it did not fly at all. They were like not buying it. So. Yeah, so the company didn't succeed in the long term, and I'll leave it at that.
I think you can probably just put the box down and take the microphone.
Sensei, you could, that microphone right next to you is open, you could probably just talk a little bit. No, you don't have to touch it.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me online? Can you hear me online?
Yep.
So yeah, there were, one of our senior members, Axel LeBlanc, is French, of course, and he's kind of a world-around citizen kind of guy. He works for the United Nations, pro bono, by the way. And Wisdom Publications is part of his organization. And he's a big supporter of Dharamsala, and he brought Ashok Rinpoche here one time. He was sitting right there just after we opened up and renovated, or had this full room. There used to be a concrete block wall right there. And before we moved here, this was Shambhala Center. First time I came here, we came to an ecumenical celebration, and I led I think it was right in that corner where we now have the going on. I led the Heart Sutra the way we do it in English, as our contribution to that event. And this place was all red and gold, quite garish. And when Ashok Rinpoche came, we had it painted, I think, white. And it's not kind of a soft mustard green, typical Japanese. So he's sitting there on the high seat, and he's looking around, and he said, Dana is providing the place conducive to practice. So you have a very lovely meditation hall here. And so that, in Tibet, everything, we like a little more color. And I guess I was saying that came and spoke several times. We joined in that ecumenical celebration. So I don't think there's any real conflict between Zen Buddhism and Tibetan. We have a different interpretation of rebirth, that Shinjin was pointing out, not reincarnation, as time to go into it here. But it struck me, one thing Shinjin said, which I really hadn't heard or didn't recall, is that Buddhism had ended about the 14th century, sort of disappeared by that time. And the early predictions in Buddhism were 4 sort of periods. of the real thing when Buddha was alive for, they use the term 500 years in one or more translations. I never thought they meant that literally. It was just like a big number, And then there would be 500 years of semblance where it was declining. And then it would be 500 years of like rock bottom, and then it would disappear altogether. So it's interesting, I think, the model of the cosmos then was the Mount Sumeru in the middle and the four continents, the Jambudvipa being the southern continent, and all these continents around. So I think they had a concept of the world beyond India, and they had Silk Road, so they knew there's a lot going on over the horizon there. But maybe they didn't anticipate the movement of Buddhism out of India and finding its rebirth in the other countries as it went. At the same time, they were experiencing the decline. Well, maybe for them in southern India was Jambudvipa, that's where they lived, that was the continent. And so that within their own context, kind of had this decline. But it's very much like the kalpas in Hinduism, the kalpa of emptiness, the empty kalpa, and the kalpa of creation, and the kalpa of growth, and the kalpa of destruction, four major cycles in the universe. So, but I never heard 1400, if you go back to 500 years BC, 2,000 years, right there.
Yeah.
Very close.
But I think it's really interesting that Buddhism essentially goes extinct in its country of origin, but flourishes in these two other places. And I think one of the most interesting things about Buddhist history is that it adapts to whatever's local. Wherever it goes, it adapts to, and it's adapting to us now.
And they say it's coming back in India now.
I think that's what makes it so universal. It adapts,
I think that is the interesting dynamic, though, that like you said, it declines in its place of origin, it's exported, but then it's re-imported back by the people who adopted it. Like, there are Westerners going back to India, to Burma, to Nepal, like, and to Japan even, and bringing back something that was, it's like back and forth.
Yeah, we talked about doing that, the missionaries in India.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out, one person has dropped off, but two people have dropped off, and we want to they want to see if John
or Randy have any comments?
Yeah, you can unmute the TV's unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, I really don't have any knowledge or experience in the Tibetan tradition, so I don't have anything to contribute to the conversation, really.
Well, okay, bye.
That's unusual.
Well played.
I think John waved his hand.
Am I the only one that's getting some static in the background? Randy, are you getting any of that?
A lot of static, yes.
Oh,
Okay.
I think maybe
So
that's why we
FYI
lost Ungun.
Okay. I'd like to share the one direct experience that I had related to Tibetan Buddhism. I had an opportunity to go to the opening of Naropa Institute, which one or two people have mentioned, back in 1974. And my experience I was only 24 at the time, so it was a kind of a fresh experience. But today, my experience is that Shogam Trungpa Rinpoche was very, very much a Zen Buddhist. Let me explain. When I arrived, I signed up for two courses. He was attracting people from all over the world, name brand artists and musicians, meditation teachers. I remember meeting Joseph Goldstein, who was a skinny little Jewish guy who had been studying in, I think, Burma or Thailand at the time. But sitting in this rented gymnasium with 1,000 plus other people on a hard gym floor, which I found to be uncomfortable because all I had was my sleeping bag, which I was trying to make into some kind of cushion. My first experience with Trungpa Rinpoche was running about, and typically this was the case, about 30 minutes to an hour late.
That's called Tibetan time. They'll even tell you
Tibetan, that. This Tibetan entered the gymnasium where he limped due to a car accident that he had when he was in Scotland. He limped over to the middle of the gymnasium where they had set up a chair and a microphone. This man was wearing a jet black suit, very professionally tailored. He had a starched white shirt and a tie. And essentially, his message was sit, meditate. And it got promoted and went out through his talks and so forth as cutting through spiritual materialism. I understood that he had disrobed because he was experiencing it as a little bit of a barrier in connecting with people, at first in Scotland and later in America. And he seemed to think that meditation and sitting was the first step to embodying this energy, this awareness, and allowing it to infuse every part of your life. And I mean, he had people there sitting and teaching poetry, sitting and doing calligraphy and flower arranging and horseback riding and archery and all of the, there was nothing that he didn't see as a vehicle. And just summing up what I took away, and by the way, Mondays and Wednesdays, it was Trungpa Rinpoche cutting through with that sort of discrimination, that sort of attention. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, it was Ram Dass, fresh from India, from his Hindu guru, who was worshiping and chanting and praying and loving and crying and had his band of musicians all getting intoxicated with that kind of spiritual union with the divine. And then back on Thursday to cut through all of that, to make room to get to know. Basically, some of the words he used was make friends with yourself on the cushion. Open up and develop enough attention to know what's going on in that brain. Welcome those thoughts, but welcome them not seduced, but to actually get to know what's coming up and arising. So coming out of there, I did not have at all that experience of colorful deities and Tantra and all that, but a man who, for whatever reason, was attracting enough support to create these organizations, these locations. And it all seemed to be, Shambhala seemed to be one of the big ones. It all seemed to be about getting that message out, not to the monastic community, but to everybody. And again, that was that was an experience I had. And I welcome any comments, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of these different things. I do have a Baba Ram Das story I tell you sometime. I was invited to the installation of the Dalai Lama at the Emory University, and they made him an honorary professor or something. I can't remember what it was. We were all up on stage. I remember they didn't have any cushions to sit on. They had like, well, they had little like a quilt like thing, and there was this Christian minister woman. I showed her how to roll up her quilt to make something like a cushion to sit on, as we heard before. Sitting on the floor is the way people sit in many of these countries. They don't sit on chairs. But the Dalai Lama comes out, and we're all sitting behind him. And there were 4,000 people, I think, in attendance that day. I also happened to be there when Richard Gere was there, introducing him, big celebrity thing, to give a talk. But in this case, he was up on stage, and there's like 4,000 people in the audience, and he was reduced to just importuning them. He just was saying, "I'm just a simple monk. I'm just like you." He realized that what he was dealing with was celebrity worship. And that gets in the way of the transmission big time. That's really one of the biggest problems. I don't have to worry about that. The Dalai Lama did. And so that was a big impression on me. It was like he has to get up every day, and he puts on some kind of pants, the Dalai Lama. But he can't not be the Dalai Lama. He has to go out and face it every day. And this is what he's running into in the West here. Back home, I doubt that they have this kind of celebrity worship amongst the Tibetans themselves, maybe. Or maybe there's built in. He was the head of state as well as the head of the church, if you will. No separation of church and state. So he's worshipped, but he's worshipped in a more genuine way than celebrity worship. Right. He's worshiping the Buddha nature or something.
Well, he stepped down from the head of state. They created, Tibet has its own, well, China is, in Tibet, China is the government, but out the Tibet in exile, they've got their own premier, I think they call it, or, what's the other word they use? Prime Minister. And he's just the head of the religion.
When he was asked in one of these many group meetings that they have with him, what he thought he would try to bring back to Tibet's democracy.
Yeah. Is the audio better on Zoom, or has it changed?
Still getting a fairly heavy staticky buzz on my end.
How about now?
Same here.
Anything better? I'm turning off channels. Any better?
Still there.
How about now?
I think we're at a good stop.
Better now.
Better now? Okay.
Lower. Yeah.
I was just going to say,
Let's go ahead and close.
use this one then.
Yeah, muted me. Okay. We'll just go ahead and do the closing verses, and won't worry about improving the audio right this second. Yeah. Beings are numberless.
Numberless.
I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. The Buddha way is unstoppable. I vow to end them. The gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Thank you very much. Next time. Thank you.